And if you need power,
I'll move mouse, or I'll move mouse, make sure the.
and you can move the laptop if you need, and if you want, this is power.
If you can't hear me, just let me know. And I have a pretty loud voice because I can't hear out of one ear. So today we're going to be talking just a little bit about Salesforce API integration patterns. It's more of a discussion. Best practices and patterns can kind of be a little bit meshing a little bit on that. But we'll talk about that today. So. First, before we start, Steve Loper, who is this guy? I've been doing development since I was 23 and I turned 50 this year, so you can figure out the math on that. I started with VB3 and front page, and then for the past 7-8 years, been doing Salesforce development. So you can figure out the math on how long I've been doing things on that. I'm 6'5". I've got a wife, kid, or 2 daughters, and goats and 3 ducks. So that's who Steve is right now.
How many goats?
You what?
How many goats?
3, and they're all 3 pregnant.
Oh.
Yeah.
When they have babies, can you bring pictures?
Yeah, they're cute. They're cute. So I think they're due in June on that. So, but my eldest daughter has show goats. So yeah, they're on that. They're good-looking goats. So. My current role is I'm the Salesforce architect over 23 orgs. They're all distinct, separate orgs, and basically on Service Cloud, we have a couple other implementations, but I get to play in 23 orgs pretty much every day on that one. So now let me tell you before we start, I want to tell you how I have almost effectively broken the Salesforce org before. There's 3 key ways that I've done that. Exceeding high volume platform events. This is a hard limit that I have gotten close to, and then been looking at the time on the event saying, okay, please let the clock slip over. Please let the clock switch over on that. So that's one way I've almost broken it. The tool that I use now is on any outbound platform event, I have a hard kill switch so that I can go into metadata and say, turn it off, because I don't want to have to call my Salesforce rep and say, hey, can you push it up a little bit more on it? But yeah, definitely, and you'll hear a couple of the other suggestions that the tool that I use is a hard kill switch on that, and also documentation, so that if I get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning, I can say, hey, go click this button on there, and then it'll kind of settle on that. The second way that I've almost broken a Salesforce org is I had a very beautifully written Apex code job that was supposed to run every 10 minutes. In the configuration, I set it to run every 1 minute. So the job started, I went to the debug console, started the job off, and it started running. Perfect, it's doing perfect. But what I didn't have in there was the way to stop it. So the job ended up running. Luckily, it was in UAT, and I'm like, oh wow, how do I stop this from running? First tool that I've learned on that is always have a kill switch on any job so that you can go into metadata and cut it off. The second tool is on my desktop, as I have a list of debug scripts so that I can go, if I can get into the debug window and start killing the jobs. But I would definitely, before it happens, figure out a way to have a list of scripts that are that's your Swiss Army knife on them. But that was another way that I almost broke a Salesforce org. The third way that I've almost broken a Salesforce org with related to integrations is not caching auth tokens. Whenever an outbound request goes in for an API, it can make 2 requests. It can make an auth token request, and it can make the initial request on there. Usually the auth token request, it'll have a time to life of like 2 hours. If you cache that, then you've cut your API calls in half. Technique I like to use is if the token is good for 2 hours. I always set the caching at 90 minutes. That way, if there's any time differences that happen, I can always make sure I'm always getting a fresh new token on that. But those are 3 ways that I've almost broke a Salesforce org on that one. So I like sharing those because I want other people to go, one, to learn it and go, oh, let me try to do this stuff in the off hours so that you don't get the 2 o'clock call in the morning saying, hey, nobody can log in or whatever. But it definitely get that list of scripts in case you've got to log on to an org and figure out what's going on. It's just nice. It's nice to be able to have those.
So when you broke it with the high volume platform events, did you open a case with Salesforce and they said too bad you hit the maximum?
We did, and it was so close to the time when they reset the rolling. We got out of it just by virtue of the time rolling over. We opened a case up, and I do have experience of opening a case up and having them reset it, or because usually they were pretty much, you kind of messed yourself up on that one. So
We had a very similar event where I think mobile or digital web started, they deployed a change, and instead of sending changes once, they were sending them at every second. And then we have in queue jobs that run every time they create or update data. So we maxed out our queuable jobs, which is a very large number. And we called and we're hurt. And we said, well, this is affecting, people can't log in, they can't make reservations, it's financially affected. They were able to nudge us up a little bit, but because the web had broken it, they had to wait for all of that backup to get resolved. And for us, what that happened is all of the records they were updating, we're also updating downstream records. So it completely blew us out for about 36 hours. It was a big deal. And we were very glad it was not Salesforce that broke it, because it matters when you can't make reservations at that volume. And it was the digital team that had to figure out how to fix it.
But yeah, from my experience on the platform events, that's your hard set. I wish we could go, here's a bunch of money, please. Please open it up a little bit, but yeah, it can be a little bit challenging there. So I'm gonna get into the meat of the discussion on that, and this will be kind of a high level, just with integrations, I want to discuss kind of the two types, request and response and fire and forget. It'll be focused Apex code related. So this is focused Apex code. There's a lot of ways to do integration, but this will look at Apex code and kind of different methodologies to be able to do that. So I'm going to start with the scenario is, and the way I kind of was approaching this is if I've got a new REST endpoint, I've got a developer, and I need to give them direction on how to implement it. So the scenario is I've got a REST endpoint that I want to request to get a hamburger. I'm going to get a specific response back from it. And then HTTP codes are used to indicate a success or response on that. And the user needs to indicate a success or failure. So imagine inside your org, you have a Lightning Web component that says, I want to order a hamburger and I got to call out. This is kind of that scenario there. We'll get into some of the, so as an architect, I need to be able to give direction to the developers on an approach. And this is, there's 100 different ways to skin a cat. This is one that works and I can give to a new developer as they're coming in on that one. So the development steps is I'm going to create the request and the response models. Those are going to be hard typed. I want those very specific in the code to say this is a string, this is a Boolean, this is so that we know the data that's going over in the request model. The next direction that I'm going to give them, and we'll get into detail on each of these, is I'm going to create a HTTP callout class that's specific for doing any HTTP callouts. Then a service class and then an API class. Now this phrase right here is, if I needed another tattoo, this would be the one. Anytime that I'm interacting with an API outside of the realm that we control, I have a very low trust on. Low trust on that I'll get a response back, low trust on the model that I'm sending is going to be accepted. So I want to build a lot of bulletproofness around any time I make a request or a response back to them, especially if it's a third-party vendor. The degree at which they build APIs, it may be good, they may have Swagger pages, but anytime that I come in, it's a very low trust model because I can't blame vendors if we don't get if we don't get a response back. So I'm very hard on vendors. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have the developer go in and say, okay, get your request model and get your response model. This is a very this is what I'm looking for. I'll have the developer say, go to the third-party Swagger page, if they have a Swagger page or if there's documentation, and get those models out there, because those are going to be your kind of implicit contract when we make the call out. So I'm choosing those. Although I don't usually eat cheddar, I usually have bacon on mine. So. But this is also a way to protect, I'm gonna say us as the org, saying, hey, this is what you said I was sending you. So it's some of them, it depends on, it's an implicit contract. I use it as a hard contract if I got to get on call with a vendor and kind of rustle feathers on it. So the next thing that I will do is there's some great tools. You go in and Google JSON to Apex. There's, I think the top 3, I will take the model and I give the developers direction. I take the model and then this will create a nice Apex class that's strongly typed that they can build against. So this is the request and this is the response on that. This gives them the ability to kind of simplify what the requests that they're making. All right, now get to some guts of the code. The first thing they're going to do is I'm going to have them write an HTTP handler class. This is one Apex class that handles just the HTTP request. That's its sole job in life. It's only going to exist just to create the HTTP request out. You can kind of overload it, and so it'll handle the post, the gets, all your HTTP verbs. But its sole job in life is just to handle the HTTP request and then hand it back off. Above that is going to be the actual we call it the hamburger service. So what this will do is it's going to receive a model. It's going to receive that model we created before, and then it's going to call the HTTP handler class. And then it's going to return the HTTP response. And the class structure is set up so that each class does one thing. That's its sole job, its singleness of purpose, so that what I will give guidance to developers to not do is develop one big huge class that does everything. I want real focused work on that, and you'll see that on the next slide. Then I'll have we'll call it a hamburger API where it'll have, depending on the depth of the APIs, it'll receive a one ID, and that may be an account, it may be a case, it may be a particular opportunity. What I want to be able to do is pass one ID into that function and then build the model and then pass it down to the service class. So it's really singleness of purpose when you're developing the Apex code. We'll see why on the next step. Trying to go as fast as I can so I can. So the key thing about the structure of the Apex class is I want to have a test class that sisters directly with this Apex class. Because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to deploy just that Apex class rather than having to deploy 50 classes up. Especially at this level, at the service class, because it's working with HTTP mocks. What I'm going to do for this test class is I'm going to set up all my mocks, all my positive mocks, my negative mocks, my 400s, my 200s, my 300s, and so that this service class can be deployed with just that one singular test class. It's made to stack on each other, and I'll say also be independent. Next one. Okay, so once I have this structure, it's a very specific structure that's replicable for developers to be able to do. Then on top of this, I can have, if I want to call it through an OR component, and I have the controller there that I can call there and respond to it. If I want to call it in a flow, I can add another Apex class on it that allows me, that wraps the invocable in there so I can call it into a flow. The other portion of this, so this other portion of this is logging. Like I said before about low trust model with REST APIs, at this level, at the API level, and kind of the call stack there, this is where I'll log everything. One of the challenges that I can run into with working with third-party APIs is your API is broken. Well, what did you send? What did you get back? Every single, this is what a drill in is every single request and response, I want to record that. I want to have a log table that I know that I can go to and say, hey, this is what we sent. This is what you got back. Because if you get a support ticket that says, hey, this coupon didn't go through, we have to go in and find exactly what the request and the response is on it. But this is one, this is kind of an Apex focused approach on that one. Go to the next slide and kind of throw it out for discussion. Trying to go fast because so from a request and response discussion, I kind of had these questions. From your guys' experience, how have you handled logging request and response? Or what problems have you gotten when somebody says, hey, this one is not working right?
Super basic with all of this, but usually custom objects to log any kind of errors that may occur, successes. So we can easily just go like grab a list and see like, okay, when did it last run? Were there any errors? What were they, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with batch jobs, but I guess,
Same thing for us. We have an Apex log object, custom object, as Kelsey said, and we're logging that. We use it for everything. So it's for batch jobs. Actually, we're also using it for flows and for HTTP outbound calls. But we're logging the request and the response and any errors, right? So that way, if somebody comes back and says we're having errors, we can see where it's broken and why it's there. We provide a lot of APIs for a lot of our legacy systems, so we have a lot of inbound traffic, assuming our services, but it's still the same.
I have used, from my experience, I have used big objects to handle some of the larger payloads, but reporting on that can get a little fussy at times. I'll use them in lower environments if the debug logs are large, but usually for a production level environment, having a custom object. One trick that we've used on custom objects or for the custom logging is this line up here. Where this is an ID of objects. If I have a singular object ID, I'll record that in the log table, and then I'm able to access create an OR component that queries the log table and says, hey, is there any logs related to this object? And that way you can kind of get contextual logs and what's happening there. What ways have you seen request and response? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the thing I ran into this earlier was like, excuse me. So let's say if we are the request coming in, right? And we are inserting something and it fails, right? So the rollback will happen. So the way I did handle in the past was like, I just put those method to create log records in future handler. But do you suggest anything else in that matter, or have you done any kind of those scenario?
Yeah, let me repeat the question back. So if you're getting a response back and then you do have to do a rollback of records, is putting the logging method into a future handler a good approach? Does that sound right? Or
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, from my experience using a future handler, that takes away any of the transactions that you can do. You can also throw logging off to a platform event, and then you're 100% on that. It's a platform event is a nice way to kind of secretly have a asynchronous process. But yeah, using a future handler will work. Sometimes you have to be a little bit careful depending on, in this scenario, where if you have multiple HTTP calls going out where the logging occurs, but future handler will we'll hit 90% of them, so 95.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like the idea of the login event. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. From my experience, I absolutely log everything. If there's space considerations, a scheduled job can offload them, or, but if you, I'd rather have the logs than need to go do a live debug with a user, because some of the fidelity that you'll get on the logs in the user, now you're getting into production having to do it, but just log everything. I'd rather have more logs than not. So.
Well, and
Totally agree. Yeah. Thank you.
requests, you can basically a lot of times take that, grab it out of there, extract it, put it through Postman, and so you can actually use that over again to test on your own.
Yep. Yeah. What safeguards do you put to ensure the user gets a good request back, or gets a good response in this model where you're waiting for a response to come back in? And make sure your user's not going, well, I don't know what happened. So from my experience, to ensure that the user gets something back, either as positive or negative, at that API level, which is actually doing the handling of it, that's where your bulletproof response is going to come back on it, if you're waiting on that. But it's at the API level to be able to do it, so that you're always returning something. One thing related to APIs that can happen at this level, and is one reason it's for the abstraction, is if you're calling an API that has a gateway, it's basically a kind of a blind endpoint that just receives a request and gets it back. A lot of times you'll get a 200. Hey, something worked. Okay. But actually in the message body, there may be a business processing error. Like if you're calling somebody to say, hey, I need a coupon, they may give you a 200 HTTP code back, but there may have been an error that occurred in it. So if you have the logging happen here, like you're logging the response, and it gives you a little bit more clarity on it. Then other APIs sometimes will return with true 404s. Hey, I did not find this patient on it. So it's just some of it you have to know or get familiar with what the API that you're calling. So, and also really the low trust on APIs. So just log everything. Because then especially if you have to go to a vendor, the first thing that they're going to ask is, well, what did you send? Here it is. And then they can go through. Helps in UAT testing also. Last question is when working with third-party vendors, what rules do you use to force, what rules do you enforce, or how do you end up working with third-party vendors? And by third-party vendors, I mean you're consuming their API on that one. So, from my experience, what I've done with third-party vendors is first thing I'll ask for is documentation. Give me documentation of any way, shape, or form of what the API will be communicating back. A lot of times that will indicate the maturity of the API is if they give you documentation back or not. If they send it to you in the email when you're on the phone with them, API is good. If you get the response of, let me get back to you, somebody may be typing it as you speak on that, but it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just getting that some level of a commitment of what you will get back is important with dealing with vendors, because ultimately, as the owner of the org, you're responsible to make sure stuff happens. So
It's always fun too when you go out to their online API docs and Swagger and code everything to what they actually have on their documentation, only to find out that It's wrong.
Dev to prod. Yeah.
It's a known bug. Yeah, it's working as expected.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that that was out of date.
Oh, you need another version number or something like that. One other technique on it is in this level of the class where you're actually doing the HTTP call out. Some APIs will have a bearer token. Some APIs have an auth service. Some APIs just want you to do something else on that. So the different levels of authentication that you would need for a specific API, I would handle it this class. That way it's, that's one of the areas where you can not know, if you're not tracking it, if something may break, you're like, oh, why is it broken on that one? And you can follow the stack down on it. But that's where you would handle the different levels of authentication. Some of them you may be I'll say blessed with using name credentials, and your Salesforce to Salesforce and the world just works. But from my experience, sometimes the API that may be on an Amazon web server that's 3 years old that nobody's touched in 5 years, but you're required to integrate with it. So it's making it as bulletproof as you can, so that when you get the call for it, you can go, hey, it's we adjusted for it, but it was their process. That's great.
I don't know where this would go, but I know our developers have implemented batch jobs
Mhm.
where they failed responses to then try again in 10 minutes or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
To make sure that all responses are.
Yeah. If they have batch job, that would, from my lens, it would be the batch job is over here making the calls, but then you can kind of re-queue on that.
You mentioned name credentials.
Mhm.
Have you played with the most recent release?
Yes, it solved the problem for me last week on that one. Yes, it absolutely. I have 2 orgs that need to talk back and forth to each other, and it works absolutely great on that. So.
But the way they, for TDX, they had mini hacks. I'll post in the chat and you guys can see it. But one of them was how to use name credentials to do an outbound call to hook the app. They give you password and username, but you're not supposed to use the legacy name credentials because that is always best secured.
Right.
For the custom headers, it was nice to make it work.
Yeah.
And I can see how even with a legacy server in AWS, you could really make that work for you with just modifying the headers that you need. Because before you couldn't do that, but the new one's really good.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. The new also inflows, it's still in beta. I wish it was not in beta. Is inflows may being able to make REST API calls on that. I'm very excited about that because that will remove a lot of Apex code, which is good on that one. So, but that's still in beta. So I from my lens, I usually don't have beta in the queue until at least goes through one release cycle, just because I don't want to call at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Do you wait until it's beta in one release or GA in one release?
GA.
Do the second release after GA?
Yeah, it's got to be. I'm sorry, it's got to be at least in GA for one cycle, just to kind of flush it out.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
So I get to use any feature of Salesforce in beta, never pilot. I don't make anything, and even GA, I usually wait 1 or 2 releases because you don't know what they're going to change or charge for the next one.
Yeah, because there's sometimes they'll take one little feator and kind of back it out, and you're like, oh, that's what I got to pay for now. I mean, they got to make their money, so I'm like, on that. So, all right, switch over to the fire and forget. Okay. So for fire and forget, the scenarios that we're talking is I want to say I've updated a record or I've done something and I need to send something over to the accounting system, or I need to send an event over. So it's sending a request from a flow, sending a request from a trigger, sending a request from Apex, and one that I like doing is sending an event from a data change event on it. Those are some of the scenarios that I kind of run into a lot of the times. And this is kind of piggybacking on this model here, where it's a strictly Apex code call element. There's other ways to do it that are non-Apex code. But, inside of a flow, I'll have a scenario where, say, after a case is updated, send the request over. I'll have an invocable class that is basically a wrapper for this one. And then in the flow, we'll have that executing another transaction. Essentially, I'm going, go do it. And I don't want the response. I don't need to wait on the response. I just need that separated into the one transaction. This has been really helpful because I can segment the work that a developer does and segment the work that an admin does into two different work streams and say, hey, just at the end of this, make the call out. This is a really, really valuable feature because you can use the power of Apex code and all that legacy stuff that you have, but then give admins the ability to do what they need to do on that. The other way that you can use fire and forget is using platform events. This gets there. They can be very powerful, but you got to be careful because you only get 50 of them. With the platform events, the way that I've seen them, the way that I've seen them best used, this is a practice, may not be the best way, is you get a little async job that you can run. It's nice that you're not worried about everything on it, but what you can do from a flow is you can say, hey, go create this platform event. And then after that, now it's running async. Now you're not having to worry about any transaction clashing on it. The great thing that I like using these for is Salesforce Labs, and it's on the next slide, has a streaming monitor that they've built. This is one of the best tools, and I have lived and died by this tool because I can get real-time monitoring into what the platform events that are coming in and going out. When I do fire and forget on a platform event, I've got replayability because I can go into the streaming monitor. If something failed during it, I can go in and say, okay, that event, that was a payload, and replay it. So you get kind of built-in ability to replay something if an error occurs. Only drawback to this thing, the high volume platform events will only exist for 3 days. So if you run into an issue, you got to kind of catch it or else it'll go. The other thing is the volume of platform events that you have in dev environment versus in prod are different. Dev, they give you, or sandbox, they give you a lot more, but in prod, that's where your rules are. But using a platform event is kind of that secret asynchronous process, and the replayability, that's important. Depending on the resiliency that I need for that, if I need something that is, say, mission critical, I'm going to put on a platform event because I need the replayability of it. But if it's something where I'm notifying another system, I'll put it in an invocable class because I don't need that level of resiliency on it. The queuable job, I use them sparingly because I've maxed them out before, and I've because of bad coding or what have you like that. But I tend to stay away from them on it. And then also, like we were talking before, you got to have the kill switches in it. But what other ways have you guys used to like implement fire and forget REST calls on that one? And I can sit up here and talk for hours, but I get boring real quick.
I don't think I've ever used an outbound message, but that would be one other way to do it.
Yeah.
Do that from flow. I've never used them. Never needed to. Never have had a soap.
Knock on wood.
You need to. You must. I think we have it there. Is everything I've done. I've never used a platform event in an outbound call. Platform events live for 3 days, right? And then they're all
High volume. I mean, yeah, yeah.
And then you mentioned in your prior slide, data change. Is that CDC? Is that change to the capture?
Yeah. I've used that before because essentially you get Apex code in a trigger, and that's kind of in its own transaction. The cool thing about it that I like is you get what changed in the object. It gives you a nice, and so if your scenario meets that, I've used them before, say, if this changes to this, move it or send it. So it's a nice way to kind kind of abstracted out. Sometimes you got to be careful with like where you're doing stuff, and it takes on it. But change data capture is another place because you got another Apex code that's running outside of an its own transaction.
Yeah, I don't think Chris will remember, but it's been years. We were downtown in one of the Orlando users groups for CDC data capture, and we were very happy about it because we were able to use them inside Salesforce to fire off other Apex services, and the limit doesn't apply there, right? So you
Yes,
were,
That's
you were-
yeah.
actually,
That's,
I did, that was a cool, it was one of the first architect tasks I did, and it's a compliance app. So when we got the result from the third party endpoint, there was a number of places, objects that had to be updated.
yep.
And that was where it really came in strong because it changed data capture, fired, and 3 other objects lit up.
Yeah.
And that solved a lot of issues for us. I mean, made it simpler instead of having to write all those, one thing to do 12 different, update 12 places. We updated all on our own, saved a lot of cycles and transaction issues.
I can't remember, I thought the limit was 25,000, but that's external, right? And then you have to pay for it. And then because of you, I'm like, oh, we can use it. And then we ended up using our org, where you guys know Jared ended up building Apex callouts from CDC to go to one of our legacy systems. So it was great.
Yes.
Yes. It's a nice
It's
little secret one.
underused. I think it's actually an underutilized feature.
Well, out of the box, free, it's 5 objects. You can enable it on. Beyond that, you have to pay for it, even inside your org.
Mhm.
But I think it's a great feature too.
It's not, it's because you kind of get field history tracking on everything. So that it's, I mean, on all the fields rather than, but
Yeah, and right now I have a process that creates audit data, and they custom built the whole thing. And it's one of the things that blew up on me for queuable jobs because we hit the limit, and because the way that was chaining, it was just making everything blow up. One of the things that I want to do is start to use CDC. My only problem is I run it on about 15 objects, and so I need to price it out to see what it would be to add those objects, or if it makes sense to just leave it as this.
yeah, that's one of the, how many developers do I have? How much could, there's always a balance in, and sometimes like on week 1, it's, hey, let's write this whole code. You're like, well, we have 50 other deliverables. We got to, purchase it on it. So it's just part of the process on it. But yeah, change data, I like using that because it's, you get exactly what was changed and you can take a specific action on that one. So.
That's Salesforce is what they say is the best pattern for data synchronization integrations.
Now, I guess the next question is, what problems, what way does the suggestions break on it? And what would you see as best practices given the scenario on stuff?
I can tell you out of the book, platform events are the top fire and forget option. It's like change data capture is for them. So they're pushing that whole concept of the event-driven architecture. That's like when I'm doing the CTA, that's usually where you go, right? You go away from that only if there's a reason to. So kind of looking to those options. And the 50K limit is for Comet D subscribers.
And it's only if it's outside of org.
Yeah, Comet D, that's how they do it.
I haven't played with the AWS event relatively new, but that's one other thing that pushing really hard. And for me, we have a lot of things in AWS, and I have an AWS architect, and so I'm going to be leaning on him and saying, how can we put this together? The only thing I think is funny is a lot of people are talking about using the event bus and offloading it that way, and at the same time they go, and we're real time with it. You're not real time with your
No, you're not exactly.
People tend to combine them and then separate the transactions. I love that, but you're not real time. Because then you don't know if it's going to be 5 minutes, 10 seconds, 20 minutes.
Yeah. Now you mentioned about the comedy. Do you have any experience? I'm not a fan of it because I'd rather know specific REST posts versus something's listening, because something, what's been have you had experience with using Comet D or?
No, not directly. Usually other people are building it out. We just tell them to go do it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's usually, that's been my experience. I call fees, but it seems to work. I haven't had any issues using it, but also I didn't code it. So there's a
Yeah.
difference when you're actually fingers your keyboard trying to make it work,
Yeah,
trying to
boy.
maintain it versus.
I'll talk to you after because I want to hear. I want to hear a good experience on Comet D and on it. So, oh, Jaden, you got a question? Oh, maybe it's disconnected.
You stop sharing?
Oh, it's connecting. Can you guys still hear online?
Yes.
Yes. Mhm.
Still here.
You're sharing, so.
Can't see the screen. Mhm.
All right, well, I think we were down to almost our last slide, and this was our how to break stuff session. And the top 4 ways that I had to how to break something in an org was do not implement logging, do not implement kill switches on cron jobs, do not implement log clearing, and do not implement auth-to caching. So I would like throw it out to the group, like what tools do you guys have to make sure that, and I always like to qualify as if you spent 8 hours Googling something and you finally found the switch, what can you share with everybody else to say, hey, I'm going to save you a whole bunch of time. But it's kind of those techniques. Like what have you found that you're like, I had known this 8 hours ago, I could have gone home. Or techniques or anything like that. It's kind of just a general, hey, how do you make sure stuff doesn't break?
So I know one team, one time started to have issues because they were inbound requests, they were authenticating every single time. And everything was fine for, I don't know, 6, 8, 9 months. And then there was a very big marketing campaign. And suddenly they were doing more than 1 login per second.
Oh.
And that has, anybody remember this? And that has repercussions to, it all falls in its face. And they did not have anything, an MQ in the middle. So they lost a lot of users because they were over authenticating. And
It's gonna lock you out, yeah.
That's one of the things I've asked the team to start testing on. Make sure that you can see how many times you're authenticating, that it's not once per second, that they're caching the session and then they're, every hour, 2 hours, whatever that is. And then for the system, just making sure we have dedicated integration users, dedicated connected apps. Don't let them share them. Yes, they can, but no, they shouldn't. Even internal applications can mess each other up. And so I think a lot for me has been around authorization and just making sure people have the right.
Writing this down.
Yeah, and I know one of my teams likes to give integration users system administrator rights before Scott gets clawed back.
Sure, it's easy.
It's easy. I don't have to set up permissions this way. It all works. Technically, but no. So definitely, especially now with the 5 free integration users, definitely do that. And the connected apps, make sure you have the right scopes. Don't give your connected app full scope out the gate. It doesn't need it, don't do it. Give them just what they are supposed to have.
At least privilege.
Yep. But a lot of times it's in development, they're like, I just want to make it work. And they forget they did that, and it just rolls through environments. So
What are your default scopes?
depends on the application. If it's something inbound for API, I just like to do API and refresh token. If you do full, you have to include refresh token for it to come back. But I try not to do the other ones. Right now I'm very deep into OAuth flows, and so I'm getting into them. But I know past experience, we've done really just the API, because that's all we've used.
Yeah. So definitely auth token. What other techniques have you had that said, hey, I'm gonna save somebody else another 8 hours of Googling to figure it out? Oh, I got one. If you queuable jobs, you have to go into the queuable job log to see if they failed, and the error message is kind of a little bit deep in there. Because we had a situation where the trigger was starting 2 queuable jobs in the same, and you didn't know which one was failing, but knowing where to find where the queuable job error occurs, because the code will run, but nothing happens on that one. Oh, here we go.
For fire and forget, how do you do your logging?
Inside, or if it's in a platform event, well, one, you got to know if you're making any HTTP calls out. In code to implement it, static variable up top that you can add your logging to, and then once usually at the end of the try catch, you'll have the either error logging or positive logging, and that's when you log everything on it. So basically, I'll indicate that every step in there, if it's something that needs to be logged, you put it into a list variable, and then when you commit the record at the end of it, because that's the last step, is to do the logging, you basically have a 131,700 character, or I always back it up by 1 because I'm always worried about that. But you basically string variable it, put all your process logs in there, and then if you have a catch variable, you log it there, and then I always put in a positive log, because I want to know that it's done. The logs get chatty, but I'd rather have chatty than not on it. So, but it's because the platform event turns into a set of Apex code. It's async at that point on that one. So.
And you said you have username credentials. Does anybody else here use name credentials? Okay. And how do you guys do the credentials between different environments? Are you creating multiple name credentials for prod and non-prod?
Mm-hmm.
What gets deployed to prod?
At this point, I'm manually create them just because of credentials and access levels, but that's the way to do it. So
are you deploying the non-prod name credentials so that when the sandbox refreshes, you have it down, or do you create them every time in your environment? Every time we create a sandbox, it's manual. It's by design just to prevent access on that one. So prevent accidentally going, hey, I got prod credentials on it, to do that. So it's slower, yes, but to prevent the accidental, I was pointing to the wrong setting on there. It's kind of a explicit gate to prevent any data going to the wrong places. So. Yeah, some interesting things that I've seen, and I do not recommend them, is using custom labels to store your endpoint. Don't do it. And then also, if you don't have your my domain name enabled, which I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you don't and you're still using the node, again, they'll just swap out this node of the sandbox for production. Again, custom labels, awful. Don't store your endpoints and credentials in a custom setting or in custom metadata. They are not protected. They're basically clear text and anybody can access them. If you put them in a managed package and deploy that, then they're protected, but almost nobody knows how to do that, so just don't do it. And again, just usually these
Something?
it's a bird. It's in your head, no. Possible. I saw them launching around, I know it's not in my head. No, but a lot of these APIs have a lot of permissions. A lot of them might be using a class without sharing because they need to be able to see all your customer data or something goofy like that, right? So I usually put a lot of emphasis on what's the right user permissions, because it's already a very permissive access that I want to be careful with.
So there's one you missed in where not to put it, was hard coded in Apex.
Well, yes, sorry, I skipped hard code. Don't hard code anything.
Hard code, if you don't know, hard code is evil. You shouldn't be used.
It works, but it's evil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then going back to your question about how do we manage between, a lot of our clients do use Fosun. Fosun does have the ability to code based on things like this that vary into environment variables. And so when you're in your sandbox, you've got a name credential named XYZ, and everything's all set up in that environment. when you promote it to the next level up, it says, oh, I see you're going from sandbox A to, full sandbox B. And so, oh, and you're promoting this name credential, XYZ, change this value from this value to that value. And then that works, it doesn't work on a refresh, but if you're doing backwards deployments, which is in most CI/CD processes, that's how you probably try to do it, then it works fine. So it'll go forward and back.
Does anybody use managed packages for the deployments?
How about unmanaged packages? Anybody using that? I'm never using either, but
I've been trying to push for us to start kind of going that direction, just because it makes it easier to reuse the code or, different clients and that sort of thing. But I'm kind of a one-man, firmer on that one.
Ways to,
one last question for you, actually. You just passed your integration architect certification.
Mhm.
Congrats, it's a hard one. What did you learn that you've been doing that you probably shouldn't be doing? Is there anything that changed on how you approach your?
name credentials, definitely. Where name credentials, definitely. Change data capture. That changed my perspective on when events occur on it. And then also, I think probably the bigger thing the bigger shift is to implementing more flows and less Apex on it, because we come from a kind of a developer heavy shop, which is, it's good, bad, and different on it. But I think the other portion of the integrations that has occurred, I can at least push vendors to some level of a REST standard-ish. Say ish because sometimes your vendors will change, sometimes they won't on it. But that's been there's probably about 6 little things that I learned during that integration training that have been helped. I think the Salesforce connection using name credentials has been probably the biggest, because it works and it does it. Here's one technique that was nice with that. The integration, setting up a name credential so that one org can communicate with another to a new custom object. So set up one org and same custom object model in both orgs. And I have one org just call out through name credentials and create it in the other one. So I'm using a REST call, creating the object, and then the destination org have a flow that's after insert, go do stuff. So I was able to put the code down to about 10 lines versus before it may have been 50 lines of code on it. And it was admin focused, but I think that's probably the biggest shift that integration had for me, was to use flows more, because they've also matured a lot. The flows have definitely grown in the past ones. So it's a good question. But yeah, it was a tough test. It wasn't easy.
You need to tell me that.
I can tell you, I hit submit answers and it's, I passed. I do not want to do this again, and I passed. This one doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You do learn a lot.
So that's the one I'm working on right now. What tools did you use? Salesforce and
Focus on Force. There's the focus on Force and the trailhead. The areas for me that were probably, I have a list. Can I get with you after on it? But focus on Force was good. Udemy, it was more test questions and brain dumps, but I want more of the explanation, because some of the questions when they test, you gotta figure them out. There's not hard answers on that one. But
My experience was, for me, integrations, because I've been an architect, just like Chris said, I tell people what to go do. I haven't done it myself. I felt I had a really good understanding of the knowledge. There's the API Patterns Bible. Like, you should know that one. And that is very useful. But after you learn the patterns, you need to understand how to mix the patterns, because the exam had mixed patterns. Like, wait a second. You never talked about best practices for mixing patterns, because actually that's not a best practice. And so the application and knowing how to mix them will help you pass. And that's where I was worried, because I'm like, what do you mean by I'm going to do a real time to a middle layer to fire and forget, but that the middle layer is handling back the response and sending something back. I was not expecting that.
Yeah, that was key on that, because it's real world. There were scenarios in there. I'm like, oh yeah, we got that. You know, but those non-ivory tower scenarios that they really drill into. So yeah, it's not an easy exam. This is my experience. I took it once and with the intent of failing it, just to get a feel for it, and then retake it. I mean, it's 400 plus 200 for, on it, but I definitely learned a lot. I learned a lot to help me keep on the rails inside of Salesforce, and not just go, hey, I'm gonna go write a bunch of Apex that does this, because there's a lot of stuff that it keeps you on the rails a lot better, especially with higher volumes.
There's an acronym that I went to the boot camp for that one. And it gives that, it's like volume, timing, direction. There's one more, I always forget the third one, right? A pattern, I believe. And when the scenarios he's talking about, if you apply those, it'll help you tremendously figure out the answer. Because that was key for me I think to passing, is being able to break down those scenarios, your paragraph long situations that you have to read through a couple, 2-3 times to figure out what they're talking about in the first place. But
what was the acronym again?
I think it's volume, timing, direction, and pattern.
And to be frank, there's some questions on there I'm like, yeah, I'm giving you the right answer, but I'm really disagreeing with this approach, just because from my experience taking the exams is you got to go and you got to put your Steve Benioff head on and say, what does Salesforce want me to do versus, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing on, but there was one question I'm like, there is no way I would ever tell anybody to do this, just because it was more, it was just a different approach that, on it. But
a lot of the best practices for that exam are use the least number of Salesforce resources and offload to your middle layer or your application to get that done there, right? Are you error logging, everything else? Don't do it in Salesforce. That's suboptimal. That's the way to put it.
Right, yeah.
Well, yeah, then you're offloading the CPU and everything else. So.
Yeah. But then when I need logging tied to an account, I definitely learned a lot on that. It was a tough exam. It definitely was.
It's funny, in real life, I try to follow that and offload, and like people own it, right? You have that sense of ownership, like that's mine. I should be doing that, handling that process versus handing it to Mule or telling them, process it the way I want it before you give it to me. Don't give it to me to process it.
That's what we run into with a lot of APIs where, and why we log everything, because we could make the suggestion that, hey, fix that date format on that field, and they're like, yeah, well, that's 6 months later. So then you end up writing a custom date validation because their date is bad. But that's stuff that happens on it. So
that's that contract, right?
Yeah, sometimes it's like there's a flagpole that we have, or there's a hill on a mountain we got to go reach, just get through it on it.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for letting me sit here and hammer and talk for a while, so I appreciate it. So
if anybody ever wants to, I know, by the way, I got more feedback. People watched your recording for the CTA presentation, and people are saying how much they learned. They didn't know what it was going to be like, and people sign up to our YouTube channel and they're watching it. So
that's great. That's what I did for it. Hopefully, see, this is what it's like. Yeah. Oh, speaking of that, if anybody's interested, Melissa Shepard just put out a great article. I only got to skim it, but if you find her on LinkedIn, she put out her history of going through CTA. So it's a lot more than just for CTA, so
It's
it's.
long, it's our whole life.
Yeah, the whole life history.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's long.
No, that's awesome. But if you guys ever want to, and don't feel like you have to be an expert at something. If you just have questions and you have a topic you want to bring up, we're always welcome to it. Same thing with people online, right? We do virtual presenters all the time. And so definitely love all of us sharing knowledge, because like I said, years ago, I still remember from Chris, really understanding the power of the change of a capture object and then implementing it at work, a couple weeks later. So all these kind of discussions are awesome. So really appreciate it. I forgot to ask at the beginning, does anybody have any celebrations or any news, any certifications passed?
I did. I recently passed my admin.
Congratulations. Okay. So I did not get a chance to take my certification at TDX because I have technical difficulties. So I'm going to be taking identity in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully by next meeting, I'll let you guys know, yeah, I passed, but not yet. So. And then I also forgot last time, I forgot to do photos. If you guys are up for it, we'll do a photo, then we'll do swag prices, and then just networking as usual. Yeah.
How do you study for your certifications?
So normally I will go through Trailhead for me. If there's focus on course, I think somebody mentioned it. It's a really great tool. But now I'm sitting for certifications that don't have other tools like that. Right now, and I was going to tell Gary, when I did the integrations, is I end up creating my own flashcards, but I do it in Excel. So I ask myself the question, then I have the correct answers. And then, because I ended up with about 400 questions for integrations, because I'm really making sure I know it well, I go back and I quiz myself on it. Right now with the identity access management group, we're doing a study group. And I'm creating, I did it last night, I'm creating summary notes to share with the group. Then I create a quiz, and it's really hard to come up with viable wrong answers because you have to understand it well to know what's really wrong, but it's really helping me a lot. So I realized yesterday writing out the OAuth flows, I just did an initial layer. Anybody that's attending tomorrow, I did a layer of basics, terms to know, here's what OAuth means, here's the roles, protocols, the grants, and then another session we're going to do probably half of the flows because there's a lot more of them than there used to be, and then the other half in the third session. But I was able to write almost the whole presentation just from memory because I've been studying it so much, and I have questions and answers. So for me, I'm a little nuts. I'm sure a lot of people here would agree. Thank you, Jamal. I have so much family in the room. I appreciate it. But no, I like to, and I don't copy and paste when I'm doing my notes because I want to type it. That way, for me, it helps me write it out. I have horrible handwriting, so I don't write out. And if you write it out, for me, you can't study from it because then it's just one more list of notes. But I've also uploaded it to a dev.org from an Excel document and have done flashcards that way. I don't trust Quizlets. I found too many of them that have wrong answers. And then I also have put the source link of my question and answer. So if I forget, hey, is that really true? I can go back to the link where it came from and I can see, oh yeah, that's why I wrote down that note because it was something important 3 weeks ago when I studied it. So that's my approach. I don't know if anybody else has other ways that they
You have a
study.
side hustle for focus on force. That's
I'm basically publishing focus on questions. That's where I am. Yeah.
I think part of it is finding your own way. Like, how is it that you're going to learn and pick this stuff up? Trailhead's always obviously the best place to start, but you go from there and figure out this is what I need to do. I need to make flashcards, or I need to read this book, or I need to look at videos and watch people actually doing it. What's his name is really good, Michael Wheeler.
Yeah.
You did it. He's slow, very monotonous, but he goes through every click and tells you everything that is going to happen. So, listen to him at 1.5 times, 2 times. But he's a real good one.
And
Follow and then just practice answering questions.
learning the type of learner that you are is important. I'm very auditory. And so sometimes when I'm studying, I actually read aloud what I'm saying or just even whisper it. But I've also found if I listen to music that I know really well, part of my brain goes into, yeah, you know that information. So as I'm taking it new, it helps me store it better. I don't have any idea if there's any science behind that, but it helps me study and remember things.
But do be warned though, when you do the certification, they will, you can't have any music going, you can't have any of that stuff, so you have to be able to focus. And if you talk to yourself, I mean, there's been time, you know, well, I'm gonna use it, they'll have to point at the screen and kind of read along, you know? And they will physically tell you, do not point to the screen.
They'll stop your testimony.
Yeah, they'll stop it, and so.
Or even if you like move your lips too much or read out loud, I've gotten stopped for that too.
Yeah.
This-
Well, because somebody might be recording you, and that's
Yes.
a way to cheat. right?
Yeah.
So maybe take it pretty seriously.
And make sure that your name on Criterion is the same as your license. I went through like 45 minutes because Steve versus Steven, they were hard stuff. I'm like, and then my license
That's
picture had me